Senator Scullion.
Mr Acting Deputy President, I rise to associate the National Party in the Senate with this motion of condolence for the former Prime Minister of Australia, Mr Gough Whitlam. Our thoughts and prayers are with his families and friends. As Minister for Aboriginal and Islander Affairs, I'd like to particularly focus on the difference that Gough Whitlam made in Aboriginal and Islander Affairs by bringing land rights into the national agenda. One of the most defining images I think we can all recall of Gough's Prime Ministership was when he poured soil from his hand into the hand of Vincent Lingiari during the handover at the land at Dargaragu. Whitlam's intentions to change the way we think about Indigenous affairs meant that one of the earliest reforms of the new Whitlam government was upgrading the Office of Aboriginal Affairs to a ministerial level. This fulfilled, in his view, an election promise designed to meet some of the responsibilities affording them at the 1967 referendum. In June of 1975, the Racial Discrimination Bill was enacted, outlawing discrimination on the grounds of race, enabling Australia to ratify the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination. Mr Acting Deputy President, in this place, in the short time I've been here, we tend to reflect on changes and reforms that are almost behind where Australia is. We've already got there and we very comfortably make those reforms in a reflection of what Australia now thinks. And almost all of Mr Whitlam's reforms were moving ahead to where we should have been as a nation. And I think certainly that in 1975 the change and even the introduction of the Racial Discrimination Bill was where we should have been, but I suspect it's not where Australia was at that stage. In August of 1975 at Dargaragu in the Northern Territory, Vincent Lingiari of the Gurindji mob formally accepted from Prime Minister Whitlam title deeds to a part of their traditional lands. The grandson of Aboriginal land rights activist Vincent Lingiari, Maury Jabata Ryan, remembers the moment when his Prime Minister Mr Whitlam returned to Wave Hill Station to the traditional owners. He told the ABC it was enormous. It's like equivalent to Armstrong walking on the moon. A giant step for him to do that on behalf of the Australian people. So this is what he said on that day, and this is back in 1975. He said, "On this great day, I, Prime Minister of Australia, speak to you on behalf of all Australian people, all those who honour and love this land we live in. For them I want to say to you, I want this to acknowledge that we Australians have still much to do to redress the injustice and oppression that has for so long been the lot of black Australians. Vincent Lingiari, I solemnly hand to you these deeds of proof in Australian law that these lands belong to the Gurindji people. And I put into your hands part of the earth itself as a sign that this land will be the possession of you and your children forever." Mr Deputy President, again, that was in 1975. I first went to the Territory some 3 years later in 1978. And that is an unequivocal message to many people in the Northern Territory who simply saw this message as a message of dispossession of farmers and white people who had taken the land from the original inhabitants. And in many ways, that perhaps not so much down south, it was seen as a very courageous political position. And I think it was possibly the position that allowed the Northern Territory, the then Country Liberal Party, to stay in power for the best part of some 30 years. But in August of each year, people gather from all parts of Australia at Kalkaringi. This is Freedom Day, where we all celebrate and sometimes reenact the walk-off. In many ways, this annual celebration is in fact a celebration of the legacy of Prime Minister Gough Whitlam. I often wonder what impact the previous life of Mr Whitlam had on some of his views in Parliament. We've already mentioned today by a number of the participants the impact of the famous Bark petition. It was rightly adjudged to have been the beginning of land rights, which Whitlam took up and gave national leadership and life. Now, it was quite a humble petition. I'll read into Hansard some parts of it. The humble petition of the undersigned Aboriginal people of Yirrkala respectively showeth that nearly 500 people are residents of the land excised from Aboriginal reserves in Arnhem Land, that the procedures and the fate of people on it were kept secret from them, that the land in question had been hunting and food gathering land from the Yirrkala tribes from time immemorial, and that we were born here, that places sacred to the Yirrkala people are in the excised land, and that the people fear the fate that has overtaken the Larrakia tribe that will overtake them. They humbly pray that no arrangements will be entered into which will destroy the livelihood and independence of the Yirrkala people, and your petitions in duty bound will ever pray God to help you and us. Now, this at the time did not have a huge impact of the Parliament in Canberra, and I suspect it was in fact that Gough Whitlam in the early stage of the war in 1942 was actually posted in Nhulunbuy, right in the middle of Yunal country. Whilst I can't find any association in research, I do know that many of the Air Force personnel had a good working relationship with the very friendly and outgoing people, not only the then mission in Yirrkala, but more generally with the Yunal people. And I suspect when he saw the petition, it meant something slightly different to him than it may have done to other politicians. This was the leader which would give breath to this petition and land rights, and he would be the one who would ensure that this became a central part of the national political agenda. Now, there was plenty of attempts in the early 1970s by Aboriginal people particularly to take their fights to the courts, and whilst the plaintiff tried with all their depths of evidence and much support to claim land ownership, Australian law at that time clearly couldn't provide a vehicle for Aboriginal land rights. It was devastating to the Yunal people, but it wasn't the end. The leadership of Gough Whitlam changed the legal basis of land claims forever. The Yunal case ended up being integral to the 1972 Woodward Royal Commission into land rights in the Northern Territory. This, of course, was something that Gough Whitlam was very strongly behind. This ultimately led to the Territory Land Rights Act of 1976, from where successful land claims all over Australia, the eventual overturning of the concept of terra nullius in Mabo case in 1972. The Whitlam legacy in the way that we engage with Indigenous Australians is today an integral part of political life. But it was different then. He used his political power, his influence and his leadership to move history on. As we look back, the change then was seismic. I'd certainly like to end with the words of Gallery Yunupingu AM, himself a towering force in continued historic courage of Yunal people. He said on the passing of Gough Whitlam, "It is with great sadness that we mourn the passing of former Prime Minister Gough Whitlam. Mr Whitlam was a unique and sincere man. He is remembered fondly by the Yunal clans of North East Arnhem Land. In his time as Prime Minister, Mr Whitlam was a great friend to Indigenous Australians. He always acted as a direct and in a determined way to resolve the issues. The bark petition started the move towards land rights, but Mr Whitlam's leadership brought it to life and made it real. He was a true friend of the Yunal people. I send my most sincere condolences to his family on this sad occasion. As leaders of Nationals in the Senate, I too send sincere condolences to Mr Whitlam's family and friends."